Okay, so in this video, what I'm trying to show you is what I did wrong right from the beginning of this art journal layout. I'm doing it in my small art journal, as you can see, and I started off by stamping a background. I really didn't have a clue what this page was going to be like. I was just playing and sort of experimenting with techniques, and that's what I use this small journal for, is for experimentation. So here I found a background stamp. It's sort of a vintage one. I believe it was in my steampunk collection, and it looks like a series of old ads, and I'm stamping it in Distress Black Soot ink. I'm using that, and then I'm going to use embossing powder on top of it. A technique that I saw on a video somewhere was talking about doing batiking with embossing powder and distress ink. And because distress ink stays wet for quite a while, you have enough time to get your embossing powder onto it. Now I'm using a silver embossing powder on here. That's probably my first mistake. Really, to do this technique, I probably should have used a clear embossing powder, but I really didn't think about that when I was doing it. So here I'm tapping all the embossing powder off and putting the excess back into the bottle. You can see it uses quite a bit because it is a full page. And then I'm going to get out my embossing heat gun and give it a blast with that and get this all melted down. Now with this technique, what you're supposed to do after you have heated the embossing powder and melted it down is you can take your distress inks and go over top of the page, as you'll see here in a few minutes that I did this, and add your color. Then after you add your color, you take a sheet of newsprint, is the way I saw it done on a video. Take a piece of newsprint, lay it down on top of the embossed page, and then using a really hot iron over the top of it, and I guess that makes the embossing powder melt back into the page. Some of it will sort of lift off into the newsprint, and I guess it gives you a flatter surface when you do this, and it sort of makes the color you've put on top of it and the embossing powders act as basically a resist. It makes those colors kind of melt into, or the embossing powder melt into, the color you've put on the page. Now what I used for this to iron it out was a small iron that I have that I use for encaustic work. They really recommend that you use an iron that you're not going to use on your clothing because, well, of course, if you get any embossing powder on it, you've kind of like wrecked your iron for using it for clothing. But with the embossing iron, that seems to be okay because you can wipe the surface of it off, and after all, you do use that iron for encaustics, for wax melting. So I'm just finishing up here on the page, melting this all in. At this point, I really haven't made any mistakes. This is a technique you could use if you want to, have a bit of shine to a page, or you want to stamp elements onto the page that you can put color on afterwards, and the image will emerge from the color because it acts as a resist. So what I'm about to do now is get out my two colors. I was using Mustard Seed Distress ink, Tim Holtz's Distress ink, and an ink applicator, and I'm just going around randomly on the page with this. And the other color I picked, because I was sort of trying to give it an old vintage look, was Forest Moss, and I just put that in, overlap it with the yellow, so it gives it a bit of a vintage, worn, distressed, stained look. So now I just realized, oh, I mixed up my ink applicators. I was using the Forest Moss ink applicator in the Mustard Seed. Not that it really wrecks anything, but you can just replace the pads on them. But I do have separate applicators for all my inks, and I have them labeled as such. So now you'll notice there's a spot right there in the center. I'm covering it right now that's a little darker than the rest. Well, that's something I didn't put on the video. I had gone ahead and I forgot about adding the color first, and I took the newsprint, put it over top of the page, and started to iron, and then I realized, oh, I haven't put on the color yet. So I went to pull the newsprint off, and the newsprint stuck to the page. So I thought, well, how am I going to get this off? So I spritzed a little water on it and tried to rub it with my finger, and I never bothered to gesso this page, which might have been another mistake. And this video is full of mistakes, people. And I tried to rub it off my finger, and it all rolled up and made, well, it left this on here. Now, in some ways, that's really kind of a neat effect because it looks like it's been damaged from time and from wear, and that's okay. Now you see what I'm doing this time is I decided not to go with newsprint but go with parchment paper. I thought it would be less chance of the paper sticking if it was parchment paper, since you use that for cooking and things like that. And that did work okay. You can see it pulled right up. Now what you don't see in this part of the video is the fact that some of that embossing powder is melting into and leaving a residue on the underside of that parchment sheet of paper, which is part of the batiking idea. And you're really smoothing out the raised part of the embossing powder when you do this, which makes your surface then workable for adding stamps, as you'll see. So I've gone over it a couple of times here with this iron, and the iron is set at very, very high temperature, as hot as it'll go. And so I've finished that part. So I've got some color on there, I've got the embossing, now I gotta figure out what am I going to do next. And as I said, I didn't really have much of a plan for this. So what I did was I looked into my stamps, and my Stampers Anonymous and Tim Holtz stamps, and I pulled out this English guy, I'll call him, in one set. I think this is a steampunk set as well, and or it might be the Traveler set. I can't remember the name of it, but I'm pressing that in, and I'm using archival ink, permanent ink this time, on top of this, since if I used the Distress it probably wouldn't stick. And well, I didn't get as dark of an impression as I really wanted, but not much I can do about that now. I mean, trying to line up the stamp again, I could do that, but I just left it as it was. And then I decided, well, I've got my stamps out, let's try this. So I don't know what I was thinking here. I thought, let's put a light bulb on, what the heck. And I kind of thought, well, maybe I could do something with a caption like, you know, light bulb represents an idea, maybe this guy's having an idea about something. As you can tell, I really didn't have a clue what I was doing with this. So anyways, I've stamped that in. I got a little bit better impression up at that part of the page, maybe because the embossing powder wasn't quite as raised up. So now I thought, okay, in for a penny, in for a pound, why don't we add some more color? So I have my Zig brush color markers, which are a water-based ink that's in those. I really like these. I like the colors, I like the way they go on. But they're water-based, so I'm putting water-based on top of something that will usually make anything that's water-based into a resist, i.e. the embossing powder. Now you can see it's going on. It's not going on too badly here. I am having a little trouble seeing where the outline of certain parts of the pattern in the guy's jacket is, because I didn't get a very clear impression on here, but I kind of guesstimate where these spots are and add my color nevertheless. Now the color in some spots is beating up a little bit, but not that badly. And in fact, I kind of liked the effect I was getting with this as I colored them in. Color wise, what I've picked, well, I am using a shade of blue, a yellow, and a red. And why did I choose those colors? Again, no idea. I've really got to work on color combinations. Although, when I got this finished, that color combination wasn't too bad at all. So I'm digging out some others, another shade of blue here. I decided, you know, to give a little bit of a contrast, and I'm filling in the rest of this jacket. So I'm going to speed the video up at this point, and then I'll be back. Okay, now at this point I decided, okay, I need to add another graphic. So I grabbed this set of gears that come from the set where the guy and, well, the light bulb didn't come from that set, but you know, it's a steampunk sort of collection. And I'm using those same Zig color markers, brush color markers, and I'm going over the stamp with them. I'm coloring in the stamp, and I'm just throwing down 3 different colors kind of randomly here and there. Now, as I said before, these particular markers are watercolors, so they are activated with water, and so they're kind of on the runny side, and I'm going to attempt to stamp an image. Now, here's another thing that's a real problem. On a piece of cardstock or a piece of regular art journal paper, stamping this is not really a problem with these kind of markers. Yes, you won't get the detail that a stamp may have. It's probably better to do this with something you're going to use as a background stamp. But the reason being is that they're very fluid, and since the color is very fluid, then they're just going to run all over your page, or at least bleed into it a little bit more. But remember, I've put embossing powder on top of this. Again, another resist. And so here I'm making the stamp, and I'm holding it down for a few seconds to let that ink go into it. And well, we'll see what happens when I lift it up here. Yeah, actually it's kind of a neat effect, and I think on something that didn't have embossing powder on it, I think that could look really neat because it gives it sort of a watercolor look. You know, do this on a piece of watercolor paper. I think this technique would be really a lot of fun. On here, not so great, although I'm really not minding how that looks. You know, right now I'm thinking in my head, I'm getting a false sense here that maybe, just maybe, if I keep going on this page, I can salvage it. That's what I'm thinking. I don't think so. So I used the heat gun to dry it off a little bit because it is water soluble. And I decided too, I better clean up my rubber stamp as well. And easy enough with these markers, you just use a baby wipe, pulls it right off, no problem. So cleanup's pretty easy. So I need to add one more thing. So I get out another stamp, and this is a stamp from that same set that has looks like an old advertising headline you might have found in a newspaper from 100 years ago. And this time I'm going to do some more embossing, using some more embossing powder. But this time, instead of using Distress ink as my base, I'm using Versamark. I figure this will hold better because, again, I'm going over on top of another layer of embossing powder. So I'm pressing that in pretty firmly into the top, as you can see, and pulling it off. And this time I'm going to use black embossing powder. Now, this black embossing powder, I got it at a store, and it's not really labeled. I just know it's black, and it pours out, and I'm noticing it's really quite coarse. It's kind of got the texture of Tim Holtz's Distress embossing powders, but it isn't one of his. So I'm tapping off the excess here, and I'm going to put the rest of it back in the bottle. That's why the piece of paper is sitting there. And so I'm cleaning up this bunch of embossing powder right now, dropping it back into the bottle. And I'm going to blast this with my embossing heat tool and see what happens. Now, you're going to notice, I don't know if it's going to show up in the video or not, but when I first start up the gun, some of the embossing powder didn't stick, and it just sort of blows away. And I thought, uh-oh, this is really going to be it's not going to be very clear at all. The other mistake I made here too is this particular stamp is probably not the best one to use a heat embossing technique with, because the letters are done in a very fancy script, and they're kind of close together, and so really it's not that readable. Mind you, I don't know if you'd really be interested in reading what it says. I think you get the idea that's an ad for some product, and it's an old ad title. So I wasn't really that concerned about it. As I said, this is a mess, so I just keep making more of a mess on it. But I haven't said quit yet. I'm taking a look at it, trying to figure out what more can I do to this. Is there any way I can salvage this any further? So I get the bright idea that maybe I can make the letters on that embossed rubber stamp ad pop up if I use some of the Dylusions white linen spray, because they're pigment spray, they're very, very vibrant. And so I thought, well, I'll put a little on my craft mat here, put my finger in it, and I'll rub it all over this. And well, it's lightening up the background a little bit, and my theory was it would go into the background, lighten it up, and then I could just wipe off the excess that's on the actual embossed rubber stamp. Yeah, not such a great idea, because wet on wet, I've reactivated any of the Distress ink on the background. So I've decided, let's give it a dry first. Dry it first, and then see if we can wipe off the residue that's on the actual black embossing powder. That's my theory. So as you can see, I was drying this, and I was making sure it was pretty dry, and the problem here is I didn't want to remelt the embossing powder either, so I had to be quick about this. Too much heat and I would just reactivate the embossing powder. So then I decided, okay, let's use a baby wipe. Yeah, clever. Wet. Yeah, it got it off the embossing powder, but it's also taking it off the page. And everything I've been using on this page, is all reactivated with water. So what was I thinking? Not. What kind of drugs am I on while I'm doing this page? Anyways, I wiped off some of it, decided, well, okay, let's just leave that alone for now. We've got kind of this milky haze. It does help the letters to pop out a little bit more, but as I said, the script that's on that rubber stamp, not such a good script. So I'm finishing up drying this, and then I'm going to think, well, what other little disasters can I come up with on this page? And, well, I'm thinking to myself, yeah, I guess I need a border. So I decide to get out my black soot Distress ink, and I'm going to go around the edges of the page. Now, of course, the edges of the page have got embossing powder on them, and that acts as a resist. So, needless to say, I'm not having a lot of luck getting this on here, but I decide to lay the page flat on the mat, on my non-stick craft mat, and just go to town on it. And I'm just rubbing the crap out of this. I'm putting it right in, trying to get it into the edges, and it actually is going on. And no, I'm not using black soot. I was going to use black soot, but I changed my mind and went to the walnut stain. I'm still looking at this as being somewhat vintage looking. Vintage mess is what I'm going to call this. Anyways, I went all the way around the edges of this, with the exception of where the coils are, because I can't really get in there with that. And, well, actually, adding the border kind of helped a little bit. You can see my pages are warping a little bit. This is a spiral bound mixed media journal, so I give it a little bend there to straighten it out. There's not a lot of product on here to start with. So then I'm thinking, okay, well, let's give the border a bit of a dry here. And I honestly and truly don't know if that really helps, but I've seen lots of videos on YouTube where people have to lay down, after they have laid down a layer of Distress ink, decide to give it a blast with the heat gun. So now I'm going back to those Zig watercolor markers, and I decide I'm going to put a little dashed line border all the way around this page. And I think at this point I'm going to speed the video up, because this is like watching wet paint dry. Okay, so now I decide to get out my white Zig pen, because I'm trying to make my stamped images pop out from the page a little bit more than they do. So I'm going all the way around the outside of this with the Zig pen. And the Zig pens, oh sorry, they're not a Zig pen, they're called a Signal Uniball white pen, sorry. With those, they pretty much write on anything. They're a really good pen. They were writing okay on here. I had to like press hard and scribble back and forth. And I went all the way around this guy. Certain parts, the white ink would not stay on the page. The embossing powder that was there, just, you couldn't write on it. There was no way. So I went around this, and actually I didn't mind how this looked when I got it finished, but then I decided I needed a wider line. So I went into my stash of pens and I pulled out a white acrylic Liquitex paint pen with a thicker nib to it, and I went all the way around the outside of this image with that pen, and that made the white line stand out a little bit more bold. Sort of gave a bit of a highlighted halo shadow effect to the stamped images. So I went all around the man in the hat with the Liquitex white paint pen, and then I went around the light bulb. Now, because I had used the Zig watercolor pens, which are water based, you know exactly what happened. Wet on wet, well, especially with the light bulb, it made some of the color run. So my white halo effect on the light bulb had tinges of blue and yellow in it. Or not blue, red and yellow in it. And I got a little bit of blue here and there from the jacket on this man into that as well. But, you know, at this point, who cares? The whole page is pretty much a mess. So I'll let you see the rest of this in fast motion. Okay, so I'm pretty much done, so I'm hitting it again with the heat gun. And as I'm doing this, I noticed that where my hand had rested upon the page, my black border, again using those watercolor markers, had smudged a little bit down on the right hand corner part of it. So after I finished giving it the last bit of heat to dry the latex white paint marker, I decided I'd give a little touch up with those black watercolor markers again, just on my little dashed lines so that they would show up a little better. And then that was pretty much all I was doing with this page. As you can see, I've used a lot of different techniques, and I think you can learn from this, and this is why I'm putting this up, to show you that sometimes you just make a really hot mess. I was playing around with techniques. I learned quite a bit about things here, and some of the techniques that I used, given proper backgrounds and proper surface for this, would work fine. Actually, when you look at the page up close, it's not all that bad, but I've done better. So anyways, I hope you learned something from this video, and well, welcome to my hot mess.